has arisen in only the last few years visibly. But the seeds of this were planted a long time ago, and it presents, I think, a major challenge to Israel, which is considered for a long time its support from Christians to be key as they make their case to the world for various matters. It's obvious that American Christian leadership has been in Israel's corner for a very long time. That, however, is changing. And I think that it will surprise you at least as much as it surprised me. What we have is an across-the-board erosion of support for Israel being transferred to the Palestinian narrative by top leadership. And I don't mean mainline churches and Catholic traditions. I'm talking about evangelical support across denominations. There are reasons for this erosion of support, but we'll get into some of this. When people talk about Palestine today, I always ask them where Palestine is. I personally don't know where Palestine is. Now, Palestine might exist in the future as a sovereign country. I don't know. It wouldn't seem that conditions are ripe for it at the moment, but since Oslo 20 years ago, that has been the plan. But it seems premature to talk about Palestine as a sovereign entity now. So when I hear people talk about going to Palestine today, I recognize they're making a political statement. And again, I'm specifically talking about people in the church. This is what this talk is about. Probably most of you grew up like I did with Sunday school maps. They sell this in Lifeway stores, the publishing arm of the Southern Baptist Convention, which I grew up in. Palestine in the time of Jesus. Jesus never set foot in Palestine. The region was named Palestine by the Romans in the 2nd century A.D. to erase Jewish history. This seems to be a hobby of despots down through history. And that was the reason, to erase Jewish history. So it was renamed Palestine. It was a geographical region for 1900 years until right after World War II, the Western powers began to carve up the Middle East and set somewhat arbitrary borders, establishing first Transjordan and then Israel after some of the other Arab states had been established. And so the region ceased to be called Palestine. It was Israel. Now, a lot of Christians will say the Holy Land or something like that. Incidentally, I normally know what side a Christian comes down on by how he refers to the region. If it's the Holy Land almost exclusively, or Palestine, I know that he's probably not an Israel supporter. Now again, the term was used for decades, for 100 years, by the mainline churches. They still do. But now we're seeing an increase in this among evangelicals, and that is disconcerting indeed. And it represents one of the key attack points, in my view, against the legitimacy of the Jewish state. The way we were. I love this photo of my late friend and mentor, David Lewis, on the right, with a very young John Hagee, about 1978. And in those days, those heady days following the Six-Day War and that sort of thing, you know, Hal Lindsey's books and whatnot, it was just in the air. You know, I talk to pro-Israel supporters all the time now, and they say, you know, when I was growing up, it was in every church every Sunday. There was a conference about it all the time. Not so much today. Not so much. And so these men represent the old guard in a sense, although Hagee has established, of course, Christians United for Israel, which is now 2 million members strong. In my view, the best pro-Israel Christian organization around. They do tremendous advocacy work and I really am admiring of their leadership team. But they are the exception today, not the rule. Sometimes I get in trouble with audiences, even friendly audiences, because I will mention something about an icon, and I use the word in quotes, among evangelicals. But in the narrow focus of talking about Israel, I think it's important to shed a light on these things, because for me, I want to know why things are the way they are. I want to know, how did we get to this point of an erosion of Israel support among the leadership? Recently, Elisabeth Elliot passed away, of course, famous as the widow of Jim Elliot. They did tremendous missionary work in Central America, and then she spent decades as a writer and speaker, a very beloved figure in the evangelical community, a graduate of Wheaton. That's where the Elliots met. And so they would be considered, if I can say it that way, evangelical royalty. However, again, in the narrow confines of talking about Israel, Elisabeth Elliot made some surprising remarks that I find disconcerting when it comes to the Jewish state. In 1967, within 3 months of the Six-Day War, she visited Israel, and she wrote a book called Furnace of the Lord. Now, don't take my word for it. If you are interested, get a copy for yourself and try to determine if she takes sides between the Arabs and the Israelis. I am certain that it is the first case of what is now being called Christian Palestinianism that I'm aware of. Again, very early on, this was in the period when even evangelical supporters of Israel were trying to make sense of what was going on. She went to the region, and as an observer and writer, she had an advantage in chronicling her experiences there. She paints, in many respects, a less than flattering view of Israel. I was really astonished when I read her book. Then, in 1978, she gave an interview to Christianity Today magazine, in which she made some really startling statements about the Israelis and the Jewish people, including her allegations that Jews in some part control the media. She also said there's no ethical basis for Zionism. What? No ethical basis for Zionism? What is the Bible? The Bible is the ethical basis, the foundation for Zionism. But she doesn't see it that way. She saw it as perhaps a metaphor. She spiritualized some of those things. In my view, classic replacement theology, the idea that the church has replaced Israel. This seemed to be her view about Israel and the Jewish people. And I think, again, this is one of the first examples of this, and these kind of ideas incubated for a long time. I'm a little surprised that her remarks in Christianity Today weren't advertised more widely, because they're quite eye-opening. Now, I just want to quickly mention this in passing. Again, the foundational reasons for why we're where we are. And in my view, again, it's only my opinion, the reason that there is an erosion of support for Israel is because there has not been good Bible teaching in a lot of the churches for a very long time. One of the reasons I'm thrilled to be at Calvary Chapel today is that Calvary Chapel has a long-standing tradition of teaching the Bible verse by verse. Would that other churches would do that as well. Because then you would see a different country. And you would see not a downturn in support for Israel, but an increase in support. In 1902, the German Bible scholar Frederick Delitzsch gave an address in Berlin, and the Kaiser was in the audience, and he gave a paper entitled Babylon and the Bible, in which he alleged that the Bible was influenced by Sumerian myth. You get that? You see that huge foundational shift? Not that myth was was a dim remembrance of Scripture, but the other way around. That man's evolving spiritual meanderings eventually gave rise to these desert riders who came up with these semi-legendary stories in the Bible. That was Delitzsch's view. That so-called higher criticism in the German academies filtered over to England, which then filtered over to the United States. And for more than 100 years, our Christian seminaries and colleges have been infected with this kind of teaching. So what happens when you relegate the Jewish accounts in the Bible to legend or myth? Well, they don't have any more claim on the land or legitimacy than anyone else. It's why Yasser Arafat can make an insane statement that he's descended from the Canaanites and was there first. What about the Jewish history in the Bible? What about the Hebrew Scriptures? Men like Delitzsch attacked it a long time ago, and in part, that is why we are where we are. When I began advocating for Israel 20-odd years ago, it was often said that in the United States there are 70 million evangelicals who strongly support Israel. I was pretty green and naive, and I guess I assumed that was true because somebody told me it was. I'll be very frank with you, I don't think that those numbers are even approaching reality. Now, is there strong support in this country still? Of course. There's still broad support in the general population for Israel. I mean, you only have to watch the Prime Minister's address to Congress and see the level of emotional feeling from even secular people that Israel has still a friend in the United States. The problem is that over time, this steady drip, drip, drip of bad teaching is eroding our numbers, and I think we need to face up to that. I don't think we need to keep telling ourselves and everyone else that almost 100 million Americans passionately support Israel in the church. They don't. This progression that started with the German critics has made its way to even American institutions like Christianity Today magazine. That even most conservative Christians think that this is their magazine. They think this magazine represents them. This magazine, in my view, represents what I'd call the Christian left. And they are very far from supporters of Israel. This is a 1990s cover where they have caricatured, I think this is just an offensive image. They've caricatured Prime Minister Netanyahu during his first term as Prime Minister, then followed by Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, and Tim LaHaye. Now, Hal Lindsey is down there holding up the world or whatever he's doing. It's all mocking of Israel and their Christian supporters. The article itself was a real hit piece on Christian Zionists. Christianity Today is part of the group, I would say, that is driving the turn toward the Palestinian narrative. And when I say Palestinian narrative, I'm talking about the Palestinian view that Israel is a brutal occupier and has stolen their land and is illegitimate and was born in sin. Okay? It is a PLO press release, in effect, that a growing number of evangelical leaders in this country are peddling through their networks, which are extensive and deep. Now, this is a little bit of a departure from what I'm talking about. Stephen Furtick, pastor of Elevation Church in Charlotte, North Carolina. Furtick is not an anti-Israel guy. That's not why I have him pictured. But he represents what I think is an interesting turn on replacement theology. There's not a lot of Bible teaching going on here, okay? It's what I call Christian self-help. And so Furtick himself has a knack for lifting a story out of the Old Testament, out of the Hebrew Scriptures, and making it about Stephen Furtick. By application, you can make it about yourself, you see. So, the sun stands still story in the book of Joshua is not about a miraculous battlefield victory for the ancient Israelites. and God's provision for them. It's about how if you believe enough and have enough faith, God will give you stuff. And He'll bless you. So sun stand still becomes your story. No, sun stand still in Joshua is not my story. It is not the church's story. It is one story of the Jewish people and God's provision for them. So, not a classic replacement theology thing, but it has the same effect. The rise of the Palestinian narrative. When the Israelis kept defeating the Arabs on the battlefield, the Arabs aren't stupid at all. Very smart, very sophisticated people. They simply changed tactics. If you're getting punched in the face, then remove yourself from the situation and come up with another plan. So their plan was to go toward political and cultural influences and undermine Israel that way. And in that respect, I believe they've been very effective. So the Palestinian narrative really began around the time Elisabeth Elliot was meandering through the streets of the Old City in the late 60s. Arafat was told by his handlers that he had to stop being seen as this terrorist mass murderer and turn himself into a revolutionary for his people. And that's what he did. It was from Arafat that we heard that Jesus was a Palestinian. Well, that's absurd. But we find ourselves in a place in America today in the church where a lot of people actually believe that. Did you know that? Did you know there are a lot of people in the pews, and I'm not making this up, they don't know that Jesus was Jewish. They don't even know what the temple was in Jerusalem. The Jewish roots of our faith are being undermined and eroded by leadership that knows exactly what they're doing. Some of them, I believe, are dupes. They are in some way well-meaning, thinking that they're pursuing justice for the Palestinian people. They're harming the Palestinian people by continuing to allow them to be enslaved by their own leadership and believing fantasies like Jesus was Palestinian. Erasing Jewish history is not going to help anyone. It kicks the can down the road. And so the Palestinian narrative that Israel is a brutal occupier and is not legitimate in the Middle East is gaining traction among too many evangelicals. And the problem is not our generation. As I said, support for Israel in this country is still strong. But 20 years from now, we're in trouble. And that's why it's incumbent upon all of us to become serious advocates for Israel in the ways that we can. This, of course, is everything is highly symbolic. The left that pushes the Palestinian narrative understands social media, understands images. The days of reaching somebody through a 400-page book are over. Okay? So, what do we have? This powerful symbol. They are showing a minuscule section of the security fence in Israel. The 25-foot cement barrier. And what do we see at the bottom? Love wins. Love wins, the title of Rob Bell's book. Okay? Love is just going to cause the Palestinians to live in peace with the Israelis. If only the Israelis will come to the table. If only they'll lay down their claim to all of the land. If only they will let the refugees back, etc., etc., etc. Love wins. Not in this case. We talked a bit last night, and I just want to mention this as well, because this is a key point in how the left uses propaganda. And my grandmother had a more specific word for it. She called it lying. They will tell you, and they being American evangelical leaders, that a 25-foot high cement wall completely surrounds Bethlehem. and is one of the biggest open-air prisons in the world. And the oppressed Palestinians can't get out because they're being besieged by the Nazi-like IDF. There is no 25-foot high cement wall surrounding Bethlehem. I've been there. One section of it has the wall so that Palestinian terrorists don't shoot at Israeli motorists and don't throw rocks and Molotov cocktails. The rest of it is the wire security fence that has sensors on it to make sure that homicide bombers don't come into Israel proper and murder Jews. That's the issue. So when I go to one of these Christian Palestinian leaders and I say, hey, why did you tell people that a high wall surrounds Bethlehem and makes it an open-air prison? I was just there. And you were just there. You surely saw what I saw. You know what they say? Nothing. Nothing. They know what they're doing. Stephen Seitzer, Anglican vicar in England, there pictured with his good friend Yasser Arafat. Seitzer represents probably the most anti-Christian Zionist religious figure in the world. The one silver lining is he's become even too extreme for his own network. The Anglican Church rebuked him recently for some really outrageous statements he had made. But his views, he's simply more in your face in public than the others. Seitzer just tells you, Christian Zionists are lunatics and this sort of thing, and he says all sorts of anti-Semitic stuff. The others couch their views in nonviolence, invoking Gandhi, Martin Luther King, the practice of nonviolence. Well, sometimes nonviolence can be violent. On the right, 2 years ago, World Vision sponsored a lecture tour called Hope for the Holy Land, led by their representative May Cannon on the right, in the middle Lynn Hiles, co-founder of the Willow Creek Association and Church in Chicago, next to her Sammy Awad, Christian from Bethlehem. They preach nonviolence, but in fact they are water carriers for the PLO. I'm just telling you what they do. I've asked all three of them repeatedly to document their charges, to provide some proof of some of their allegations that that Israelis control all the water and the Palestinians are thirsty, that they're starving out the Palestinians, that the IDF are brutal Nazi-like occupiers that shoot women and children indiscriminately. When you ask them to provide documentation, do you know what their answer is? Nothing. Silence. Why is that? If you passionately believed something that you were telling church audiences and writing about and speaking about, wouldn't you be willing to back it up or at least try? Why do they not answer? It's a question you should keep asking yourself. Here is Lynn Hiles and her friend Todd Dethridge, the co-founder of the Telos Group, which is a Palestinian advocacy group based in Washington. Mr. Dethridge came from a solidly evangelical background. He also worked, I believe, in the George W. Bush White House. Lynn Hiles, as I mentioned, wife of Bill Hiles. They co-founded Willow Creek. You should know that Bill and Lynn Hiles have been advocates for the Palestinians since the 1970s. This is not new stuff. In the 1970s and 80s, you couldn't stand up and advocate for the Palestinians because the leadership was still pro-Israel. Now they can. They are at the American Colony Hotel A heck of a great hotel, by the way. And also a meeting place for all sorts of leftists and Palestinian propagandists. This, for me, is a disturbing image because it is Lynn Hiles, apparently with her friend Stephen Seitzer. Now, Seitzer is a serious enemy of Israel and her Christian supporters. He has made all sorts of outrageous statements, really goes out of his way to agitate. If Lynn Hiles is, as she claims, pro-peace, pro-Israel, pro-Palestine, pro-Jesus, why is she sitting next to Stephen Seitzer? Seitzer, by the way, has links to the BDS movement, which we'll talk about this afternoon, which means that Lynn Hiles has links to the BDS movement. This is a piece that ran in Sojourners magazine. Sojourners is published by Jim Wallace in Washington. They're heavily bankrolled. Wallace identifies as an evangelical. Now, I'm talking to evangelical audience, right? Okay, I'm going to talk turkey with you. Jim Wallace is no more evangelical than a bus out there parked on the street. They are not evangelical, at least in the way that we understand evangelicals. He's a leftist. He's a progressive. And so, it's natural for him to promote Palestinian propaganda. You have here in this image, well, first the article by Munther Isaac, how evangelicals are learning to be pro-Palestine, pro-Israel, pro-peace, pro-justice, and always pro-Jesus. Come on. So again, the images are powerful. You have the IDF soldier with his machine gun trained on the defenseless, hapless, ball cap wearing, downtrodden Palestinian who's either just trying to go get some food or see a sick family member or what have you, but if he takes another step, he's going to get shot. Symbols are powerful, and places like Sojourners uses them to advocate for the Palestinians and bash Israel every chance they get. Now, in evangelical circles, Perry Noble is a little controversial. He kind of says some outlandish things sometimes, is trying to redefine the Ten Commandments and whatever. I don't really get too much into what Perry Noble talks about, but where I can, I want to give props to someone like this because he runs in the circles that I'm talking about, but evidently Perry Noble is sincerely pro-Israel. This is a recent blog that he wrote. I thought it was very good. Should evangelicals stand with Israel? Good for him. And by the way, Lynn Hiles, I think back in the spring, took a trip to Iraq with several friends of hers to meet refugees. So kudos to her. Kudos to her for putting her life on the line to go into a place like that and try to do something to help Christian refugees. I don't want it to be said that I always bash someone like Lynn Hiles just because I want to. Credit should be given where credit is due. And on that count, she deserves our respect. So, all is not lost, but I will tell you that, again, in the circles that Perry Noble runs in, Bill Hybels, Andy Stanley, Rick Warren, this would be an anomaly. They don't all talk about Israel. Israel isn't their thing, but if they did, when they do, it's more centrist leftist in perspective. Hey, look, we gotta talk about these things. One of the reasons that we're in the position we're in, this erosion of support among leadership, is because we gave a pass to people when we shouldn't have. I've been around Calvary Chapels a long time. As I said, I admire them greatly. But this is a recent blog post at the official Calvary Chapel site. It's entitled, "Do Christians Need to Rethink How They Support Israel?" You know what? I read it, and it's a mixed bag, at best. Okay? A little disturbing. Out of Calvary Chapel? What? Do you know why that's happening? Palestinians aren't stupid. They don't need to curry favor with the Catholics or the main line. If you want to attack Israel in the United States, you go straight into the heart of their support. You go straight into the heart of Pentecostalism, the Southern Baptist Convention, the Calvary Chapels, and you try to make inroads. Now, I'm not saying that Dominic Hernandez is that, but I'm telling you that somebody's influencing him. So, when I see things like this from sources like this, I become very concerned. 2 years ago, when the World Vision cadre went on their lecture tour along the coast here, they stopped at a Calvary Chapel. And you know what? Calvary Chapel leadership rebuked them. They pushed back on that. Kudos to Calvary Chapel for doing that. I'm not concerned about Calvary Chapel today. I'm concerned 20 years from now, if we don't stem the tide of Palestinian propaganda. I'm going to talk a bit more about Anna Baltzer and the BDS campaign this afternoon. We're seeing something really weird happen in evangelical circles. The leadership is absolutely obsessed with leadership. Leadership, leadership, leadership. They write books about it. There's platitudes that they tweet. Honestly, they're laying it on a little thick. Leadership, leadership, leadership. So there are several groups that have formed to position themselves as the leaders of the leadership movement. See? About 15 years ago, Andy Stanley and friends created Catalyst conferences, which was birthed from the Leadership Network and that sort of thing. My point is that they have crowds like this. Now, this wasn't one of them, but a Catalyst conference looks exactly like that. They fill arenas with thousands of pastors and youth workers from evangelical churches. And they invite, as keynote speakers, a guy like Cornel West. Cornel West in an evangelical setting? Are you kidding me? Why are they inviting Cornel West? The radical Princeton professor, I think he now teaches at Union Seminary, the one who calls Louis Farrakhan his dear brother, the one who makes allowances for the Black Panthers. I was just at the Justice Conference in Chicago last month. Brother Korn spoke to a couple thousand millennials in the Chicago amphitheater downtown. I didn't understand about 60% of what he said, but what he did say was a little frightening. His worldview is very left-wing. He's also anti-Israel. He's friendly with the Palestinians and that sort of thing. Cornel West is being mainstreamed to evangelical audiences. There's no question about that. I have asked the leadership of Catalyst why they had him speak in 2012. I've asked 5 times. I've gotten 5 non-answers, including once face-to-face. Not going to answer. They don't want you to know who they're bringing in to speak to your children, to the millennials. They don't want you to figure that out. They're left-wing progressives. So this is passing as leadership conference material. Anna Baltzer is one of the leaders of the BDS movement to hurt Israel economically, and so you see there the network. She's praising Cornel West being there and other various Palestinian propagandists. The thing that you have to understand is how widespread this problem is. This is a photo of Cameron Strang, who is the publisher of Relevant magazine. Relevant is probably the premier periodical for Christian millennials, the 18 to 35-year-olds. His father has a reputation for being pro-Israel for decades, which is another interesting topic altogether, the movement away from the father's worldview by the sons. Somebody should write a book about it. There's so many of them. But Cameron Strang has been going to what he calls Israel-Palestine. Again, I repeat, I don't have a clue where Palestine is. But he goes there with his friends, like Lynn Hiles, where they are met by their Palestinian handlers. Now, they will tell you that they meet Israelis and Palestinians, Christians, Muslims. They want to tell you that they have a balanced view. What they're not telling you is that every person they're meeting is a leftist. Okay? There are Israeli Jews that demonize their own country. That's who they're going to talk to. So look at the image. Here's Cameron Strang, this introspective young publisher in America, and he's looking at the tragedy of the wall that surrounds yet another Palestinian city. Where they touch on it in the magazine, Israel is almost exclusively criticized, demonized, including accusing them 6 years ago of the IDF of harvesting the organs of Palestinians. That is classic medieval anti-Semitism. Last year, according to Mr. Strang, his print magazine and the digital media formats reached 73 million readers. 73 million. He wrote a cover story last year bashing Israel and supporting the Palestinians. And then he was going to have a podcast discussion about it. He got a little too much pushback and he canceled the podcast. When I asked him to document several things he put in the magazine, he refused. I want you to remember that. Remember that common thread. Why do they not answer questions about what they tell in public? Is there no accountability? Can you just say anything about Israel and get away with it? Yep. One of Cameron Strang's friends is Donald Miller, the author of Blue Like Jazz. Many of you probably read that book. I did a decade ago. He is a very popular Christian writer. Now has moved into the leadership circuit. He teaches workshops, and I think has turned that into a pretty lucrative career. Donald Miller goes to this place called Israel-Palestine, and he talks to all sorts of people, including the PLO. I mean, seriously, if this weren't tragic and infuriating and diabolical, it would be funny. He's going to the PLO to get a perspective on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Then do you know what he does? He comes back. That's not it yet. He comes back and he writes blogs demonizing Israel. He accuses them, the IDF, of murdering Palestinian women and children. A woman puts a rose on a tank so she gets shot. Seriously? You know what I think? I don't think that story happened. I've asked him 7 times to document his charges. He won't even answer. He accused, in a 2012 blog, he accused the IDF, the Israelis, of withholding food from the Palestinians. He says that they control the daily calorie intake of Gazans. What? What kind of world are we living in? What kind of evangelical atmosphere are we living in? Where is the outcry from evangelical leadership who should be taking Donald Miller to task for carrying the water for the PLO? They're lying about Israel, demonizing Israel to the next generation, knowing that the vast majority of people will never be there themselves and see it with their own eyes. They simply accept what leaders like Donald Miller say. It's really quite extraordinary. This is a tweet by Aaron Nyquist, son-in-law of Bill and Lynn Hiles. He's quoting Brian Zond, who says, Christians are followers of one who was tortured and killed by a superpower supremely committed to its own security. What they're doing is, this is a liberation theology theme, and what they do is the Palestinians will appropriate a biblical story and make it their own. Okay? For example, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph were victims of a brutal occupying foreign army. And so are the Palestinians. Right? The Nativity story has nothing to do with Palestinian nationalism at all. But that's what young people are being told. This is incredibly irresponsible of people like Aaron Niequist and Brian Zahnd. Nobody says a word. Nobody says a word. You don't hear any Christian leader today at top levels answer this kind of stuff at all. They just let it go by. Now, there is a thing going on now. I read a blog recently. The writer coined a term, Christian anti-Judaism. Okay? Now, this is a quote from Ronald Floyd, who's the current president of the Southern Baptist Convention. He says, "We did not celebrate what happened in Egypt, but what happened at Calvary where Jesus died for us." Now look, I don't think Ronald Floyd is anti-Semitic. I don't think he's anti-Israel at all. That's not the point. The point is, look at how this attitude seeps into the consciousness. And this is my take, basically denigrating the incredible Passover story, the incredible exodus from Egypt, from slavery, that is uniquely Jewish, denigrating that to uplift your own, your own faith tradition. Again, Ronnie Floyd himself is not in the camp of those I've been discussing. No, some of his friends are. But look at the way it's framed. To marginalize Jews and uplift Christians. This is a Facebook post by a fellow who works in Christian media. He says, started reading through the book of John with my boys tonight. When I asked what nationality Jesus was, my 11-year-old said, Christian. Then he stares at me like, are you kidding, when I corrected him by saying Jesus was Jewish. Well, kudos to Marcos Perez for doing that, because that's exactly what we all need to be doing. Because you know what? Our kids don't know that Jesus was Jewish. They think he was a Christian. They think he was a Gentile from Athens, I guess. I don't know, somewhere, Milwaukee. They don't have a clue. They don't even know about their own faith heritage. And so, very good for this fellow for teaching his sons proper history. We need to do more of that. That is one of the keys to effective advocacy for Israel, is educate, educate, educate. All of you can do it wherever you are. Wherever you are. Get engaged. Don't believe the propaganda that you as an individual can't make a difference. Of course you can. People on the left are making a difference for their worldview. Why don't you get in the game? Jewish-Christian Dialogue has been growing in many ways for several decades, certainly since the 1970s. The America-Israel Friendship League, sponsoring the seminar, has been at the forefront of that kind of activity, bringing Christians and Jews together to talk about issues that are important to both of them. They sponsor delegations to Israel. They also run a terrific world-class program called Youth Ambassador Student Exchange, YASI. I encourage you to look at their website, aifl.org, and look at what they're doing. They send American students to Israel, and then vice versa, bring Israeli students here, interact with each other. By the way, they don't confine it to that. They have Muslim students, and it's sort of it's an effort to let them get to know each other. And actually, I think if there is any hope for the future, it is that some of the young people aren't strident like a Yasser Arafat in the past, and recognize that to live peacefully with your neighbors is a good thing. So Jewish-Christian Dialogue is not hopeless. There's a lot of good things going on, but again, It's the emphasis by the left on targeting the millennials that is the real problem. This is a photograph of Stephen Williams on an AIFL-sponsored Yassi trip here in Jaffa. A funny little image of Napoleon there. Jaffa, the great historical city, the setting for the Jonah story. Israel's best ambassadors are people who have been there and then come back with the real story. You know, that Israel is not an apartheid state, that Israel is not brutally occupying the Palestinians, that Palestinians don't have any rights in Israel, etc., etc. People who go there are perhaps the best advocates, but that doesn't mean, again, that you can't be an advocate as well. And I would implore you, at this moment in our history, and I'm talking to evangelical Christians, get in the game and help stem the tide of this Palestinian propaganda that threatens to take down Israel's support in this country in the next generation. I'm not being melodramatic. We don't have the option anymore of just letting this stuff slide by. Make ambassadors. Be an ambassador yourself. The ties being strengthened with evangelicals are really important, and they're at top levels. This is, of course, former Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon with Ken Bialkin, the chairman of the AIFL. Both men, and I met Sharon once, so I can say that I knew him. Both men love and appreciate evangelicals that are supportive of Israel. I can tell you that for a fact. They have a genuine, warm feeling for us and genuinely appreciate our support. And they are committed to continuing this strengthening of ties, especially, again, as I said, at this hour when we have several threats and dangers and challenges coming from different directions. I encourage you to make yourself aware of really good resources out there. And by the way, I would be remiss if I didn't thank the Israeli consulate for providing some really neat materials in the lobby. Also some information from the AIFL out there that you can take. I would encourage you to get to know these people and get to know their circles, their networks, their friendship. Camera.org is a terrific resource for media bias against Israel and the West in general. Of course, the Jerusalem Post, shameless plug for me, I write for the Post. Wherever you are in your life, you can carve out some time to resolve to be an advocate for Israel. There are people out there who will help you do that. So don't hesitate to get in the game, as I said, because the stakes are very high. I was talking with a Christian supporter of Israel who works for a large organization, and he said if we don't do something, within 10 years the campuses will be gone. They're virtually gone now with left-wing thought. And there's a growing rise in anti-Semitic fervor all over the world. It is especially acute in our universities and colleges. It's a topic for another time, but you would be stunned if you knew the kind of worldview promoted in some of our most famous seminaries. When I was at the Justice Conference and I was in the area where ministries and organizations and publishers were displaying their product, I came across the booth for Fuller Seminary. I came across the booth for Wheaton College. Both are sending plane loads of students for trips to Israel, Palestine, so that they can be indoctrinated in PLO propaganda. It's happening everywhere. I can't stress enough how serious the problem is. I would put it this way. The other side has a head start on us, but it is not a fait accompli. They haven't won yet. And we can still make progress in educating the next generation into just who Israel and the Jewish people are. There are resources available to you to do that. So thank you very much. As you see, I did not cut into your lunch hour. We will reconvene at 1:30. Thank you.